Okay, welcome. Those who are in the regular Tuesday training course will find that it's a bit different today. We've got some other people with us. In this lesson, every course, it's open to other volunteers at 2RRR who want to refresh themselves on broadcast law and regulations. And we've got a big group tonight joining us, which is fantastic. So all of you who are in the regular class, if there's someone you don't know, it's probably someone who is doing a program at the moment. Use the coffee break and the time afterwards to get to know them, introduce yourself and find out what shows people are doing. And equally, many of you are familiar faces. Some of you have done the course before and come back for a refresher. Others have not, but I know you from 2RRR, so please share your knowledge with this group of trainees, the latest group in the radio training course. So we're here tonight for broadcast law and regulations, and we'll do our usual timing. We'll take a short coffee break in the middle. We'll finish by 9:10 at the latest. You'll see that Andrew is here too, filming this. That's because we have 2 or 3 people who can't make it, and it's fine by me if it's filmed. I'm going to put that up on YouTube and make that link privately available to those who couldn't get here. If you don't want to be filmed, then don't head towards the camera, but it'll be just on me mostly. Okay, for those who don't know me, I'm Steve Ahern. I've been doing this course for quite a while. My normal job is that my company does training all around the world. We consult to big radio networks and we do training courses like this and with a whole lot of things. Oh, and a couple of people asked me, could they buy my book? I brought 2 copies, so if you're one of those people, $50 cash. Okay, we finished last week just before this last slide, so I'm going to start here. But, you know, those of you who are experienced people and you've just come here for the broadcast law session, maybe this will be useful for you as well. So we did last week some sessions on speaking and breathing, how to use the mic well, and some general presentation tips. And this last slide is just a bit of a warning of things to avoid. So these are some of the key sins that you should not commit when you're a radio presenter. Silence is the worst one. Dead air, they call it. If there's silence on the radio, then there is no radio. It's just a blank spot on the dial. So do not let that song finish and keep the mic off. Do not let long periods of silence go to air. Always have something ready to go. If something does go wrong, if it's a small thing, don't make too much of it. No need to apologise for the little things. If the transmitter's off air for half a day and you come back on, yes, apologise. But if you just play the wrong song or you've got a few seconds of silence, then you know that it wasn't a good thing to do. But no point drawing attention to it. There's no need to apologise for those things. Just keep moving. The whole point of any radio show is move forward in a positive way. You're always moving forward. So no need to apologise. If you make a mistake, just get on with it. Oftentimes, the most common mistake is that you'll announce the wrong song. If so, well, the people who know that song already know you're an idiot. People who don't know until you tell them. And then 100% of people know you're an idiot. So no need to really correct yourself, or if you want to correct yourself, don't apologise, just come at the end of it and say the correct name of the song and the person who sang it. Repeating the same phrases or messages exactly the same way, over and over again, repetitive during the program. So in that sense, are you saying the station name the same? Do you say your name in the same way every time? If so, try and vary it. It's those regular things that you often say: time, call, station ID, your name, name of the program. If you're always saying it in exactly the same way, it can get tedious. It can have that echo effect for the listeners. So just find little different ways of saying the same thing. If something goes wrong, never blame the equipment. Listeners don't understand the equipment. It's like being on stage in a theatre and something goes wrong and you stop the play and you call out the people from behind the curtain and you say, now, you made me go wrong, the prompt was wrong, or the lights were wrong. Nobody would sit through a play like that. They wouldn't tolerate that. Well, if you're blaming the equipment and telling people what's going wrong all the time, that's what you're doing. You're messing up the flow of the program. So things go wrong, that's okay. Just recover and keep going. Talking over song vocals is generally not a good thing to do. No point breaking into a song when the person's singing. You might talk over the beginning and the end because the music is there, it's made for that. But once you commit to a song and the person is singing, then that's somebody's favourite song. Why ruin it by talking over it for some reason, to announce no more calls or the prize has been given away? That's okay. They can wait 3.5 minutes till the song finishes and then you can tell them. So try not to do that. And again, same thing, fading down songs halfway through. Just think, that's somebody's favourite song. If you deprive them of the second half, then they're going to be annoyed with you. And the last thing to draw your attention to, and new presenters, this won't mean anything to you yet, but when you start to do your programs, you can think about it. Those of you who are regularly on air, this is something to think about. Timing out, finishing your program on time is a really important thing. Going over time, or in fact going under time, is no good. In radio, it's a timely medium. We like to keep time. We like to start and finish top and bottom of the hour when we're supposed to. And it's a good self-discipline. Even if your colleague who's coming in next has a bit of flexibility, it's still good discipline to finish at the time that your program's meant to finish. The trick to do that is not to get to the end of the show and then think, oh, I've got 2 minutes to go and there's a 3-minute song on. Too late. So you have to start thinking about all the things you've got to do from 1:45 the hour and then work out, okay, I've got 15 minutes, I've got 3 songs to play, they're 3.5 minutes each, that's 10.5 minutes. I've got a minute of promos to play, that's 11.5. So how much time have I got to talk? 3.5 minutes. If you just think like that, then everything will fall into place. But don't wait till the end of the show to think about timing. Think about back timing it from about 1:45. In fact, in every show, you should always be just calculating time on the run. In 60 minutes, you've probably got time to play. If it's a heavy music show, you've probably got 15 songs you're going to play. If it's light on music and you have more talk, maybe there's 8 to 10 songs. And if every song is roughly 3.5 minutes, do the maths. If it's 10 songs, 3.5 minutes, that's 33 minutes of songs. Then you've got 27 minutes of talk and promos and things. So when you're planning a show, think about the mathematics of it for every hour. Okay, that was just a few things left over from last week. Now to the main topic for tonight, broadcast laws and regulations. Now, I've given you some readings there, but please do take some notes as well from the slides today. Next week, for the regular class, I'll be giving you a quiz, and all the answers are in the papers that you've got, so no need to panic, no pressure, but do take some notes just so that it sticks in your head. So this is a complicated compliance business. If any of you have ever been in a compliance job where you have to check health and safety or any of those things, it's hard work, but often those things are just in an office job. So people come at 9, they go home at 5. What you're looking for is the electrical cable secure, or is there some tripping hazard or something? It's not a big deal usually. Think about radio though. Radio is on air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. That multiplies the risk far more than just a standard risk assessment in an office, because we let anybody, once they've done a training course, we let anybody go on the air. How scary is that? Think of the damage you could do. So that's why you're here tonight, and that's why it's a really important compliance lesson in this course. But there is a big risk. There are various risks. There are small things that you can break, regulations that you can contravene, and you might get a slap on the wrist. There are higher level regulations and codes and standards that you might contravene, and then the station might get a slap on the wrist. And if they break those rules 2 or 3 times, they might be in serious trouble. They might get their licence audited. The regulator, ACMA, might have a close look at what they're doing and how they're doing it, and might force them through some enforceable undertakings that they call it, to do some remediation to fix the problem. And at the highest level of danger is defamation. You could get on air and you could defame someone, and the station could be forced to pay damages of about $250,000, and you could be joined in those damages. So pay attention. You want to know what defamation is and how to get around it. Defamation will come after our coffee break. I'm saving the best for last. In the first part, I want to talk about the other regulations, codes and standards that are less worrisome in terms of the money damages that you might have to pay, but they're equally significant because the station is required to comply with all of those. So in this business, the licence is the business. The station, the board of directors, the people who run the station have to make sure that everybody who goes on air has at least enough knowledge to avoid problems, because their job is to safeguard the licence. If you lose your licence, you're forced to turn off the transmitter, and that's the end of 2RRR. So people in charge who run the station's first duty is to protect the licence. If you make a mistake, they will have to talk to you about it. They'll have to explain where you made a mistake. You'll have to just accept that and learn and not make the same mistake again. Every station has various mechanisms of complaints and reviews and things that they have to do in formal terms for this very reason, to protect the licence. So don't be worried about it. Everybody makes a mistake. Most of the mistakes are small. Most of them can be fixed with a conversation and a learning of how not to make that same mistake again. So it's not a big deal, but it is important, because this is a heavily regulated industry. My suggestion is turn the brain on first before opening the mic and engaging the mouth. Think first. Think about the regulations, the codes, practices, defamation, and the things that might go wrong. Because it's a high-risk industry. We're on air every day. So, what could we be affected by? Well, codes and standards, and I want to spend the most time on that first up. Codes and standards are very similar. Codes of practice are something that radio stations, community radio stations, get together as a group and they decide between themselves what are the right things we should do for our sector. And you'll remember in the first lesson I talked about how we have national broadcasters, the national sector, we have commercial broadcasters, that sector, and then we have the community sector. So each of those sectors has their own codes of conduct and practice, and they work it out inside their industry. And then, once they've done that, they take it to the regulator, ACMA, and the regulator says, yes, we accept that, or maybe they have a conversation and say, well, you know that guy called Kyle, when he put somebody, strapped up a teenager to a lie detector, we don't think that's a good thing. So have you got a code of practice for that? If not, go back and get one. The commercial radio industry now has the Kyle Sandilands code of practice that says they won't strap teenagers to lie detectors and ask them about their sexual habits. Funny that. Surprising they didn't think of that before. There are also standards, and they're the compulsory elements that are not negotiable. And they're things like you must keep your transmitter on. You must make sure that if we've given you a frequency, you have the technical ability to keep it on because it's an important service. And there are a whole lot of things about the transmission quality, how you shouldn't change your frequency to interfere with others, and a whole lot of technical standards and other content standards. So we'll go into those in quite some detail shortly. There's also a whole lot of other areas where usually government departments poke their nose into our business. Very annoying, some of them more so than others. Gaming and racing, for instance, they poke their nose in when you have a competition because it's that department's job to make sure that people don't rig competitions or that they don't get a book of raffle tickets and pretend there's a prize and sell a raffle ticket for $10 each, but don't give anyone the prize and keep the money themselves. So the Gaming and Racing Department does a good job. It regulates a whole lot of competitions in our state. They're state-based departments. But it also looks into radio. I mean, it has much bigger fish to fry. Racing, for a start, is a big one when there's huge gambling in racing. Most of their attention is turned to there. So from the point of view of radio, we're very minor to them. The only time that they come into play is when you have a large competition with a prize, a significant prize, and then they require you to register that competition. And in registering, you have to do two things. You have to prove that there is a prize and that you're intending to give it away. And you have to explain how you're going to select the winner for that prize. But you know, it hardly ever affects community radio because the threshold is about $15,000. So unless 2RRR is going to give away something worth more than $15,000, you don't have to worry too much about that. Alcohol and tobacco, well, we know that in this country, tobacco advertising is illegal. So you can't advertise tobacco, you can't advertise cigarettes. Alcohol is not illegal, but the community sector voluntarily decides to play that down. And when we come to that, I'll tell you a bit more about it. And then there are a range of other things. We'll come to them later. But the point is that a lot of people poke their nose into our business. So there's a lot of compliance, and a lot of compliance that the board of directors have to do. Thankfully, they do the boring paperwork about all that. All you have to do is just be aware of the trouble spots, and if you're potentially going into an area that might cause trouble, think about it, find out what could go wrong, and then structure what you're going to say in the correct way. In one night of training, I can't give you every answer for everything. What I can give you is enough information to ring the alarm bells. If something doesn't seem right, then go and talk to somebody more experienced and ask them a question. Will this work? Is this right? Should I do it some other way? Most stations, and certainly my philosophy is, don't just say no. When somebody wants to do something on the radio, no point saying no. That could spoil a creativity, that could ruin something that they'd planned to do. So I try never to just say no. I try to say, well, that's a dangerous area. What are you trying to do? Okay, let's work out how we can do that without getting into danger. So, to do that, you need to know some details. And one of the important things you need to know are the CBAA Codes of Practice. CBAA, as we know, is the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia. And these are the codes of practice that all the community stations got together and formed for themselves. So there's 8 codes. The last one is just that they'll regularly review it, usually every 3 years. But the other codes are quite significant. And I'm going to put up a page for each one. It's going to have a whole lot of little writing. Don't try and read it, you won't be able to. I'll point out the key things. You can find all of these on the CBAA website, cbaa.org.au. If there's something that you're thinking about that you might need more information on, then just go to the CBAA website, read the code in detail. Also in the station are booklets where each code is explained in a couple of pages. So let's have a look at each one. Code 1, broadcasting to meet our community interest. So this one is first because it puts the community first. That's what this sector is about, community broadcasting. So this says that we'll be involved with our community and we'll broadcast things that are relevant to our community. Let me point out a few things as we go along. Each community radio station will be controlled and operated by an independent body that represents its community interest. So 2RRR is an example of that. Every year, if you're a member, you can go along to the AGM and you can elect your board members for that year. And they'll represent you and they'll run the station for that year. And by the way, these are community groups. Remember we talked about that in the first week. If you've got some skill to contribute, when it comes time, put your hand up and serve for a year or two on the board and make your contribution if that's an area where you can help, because every community organisation always needs people on their boards to help them out. The significance of that is it's not owned by a private corporation. The profit isn't going to someone else. Different sectors are different. The commercial sector, those stations are owned by private owners and they keep the profit. And also they arrange the content on the station based on the profit, the advertisers or whatever it might be. A community station doesn't have to do that. Its primary purpose is to do what it does for the benefit of the community. And that's why that's number 1.1. It's all about the community. The next few are about having policies in place, corporate governance, complaints mechanisms, etc. And RRR has those. I've seen them. I've worked with the board over the years. They have some very good policies, internal policies about a whole range of things. If you ever want to see them, they're freely available in the station. It's generally things about complaints handling, membership, etc. Third one is that stations will have training in place so that anybody who wants to get on air from the community can just knock on the door and guess what? Come to a training course just like this one and learn how to make radio. And once you've been trained, then you can get a show. Where that show sits, how it's structured, all that, those things have to be discussed, pitched and negotiated with the board. But the principle is that if you're a member of the community, you can just knock on the door of the station, and after a little bit of training, you can be on air. That's really empowering. You can't just get on air on the ABC or on commercial radio, but you can on community radio. And that's one of the key principles to empower members of the community by giving them a voice in media. Written policy documents, blah blah, finances, etc. Written policies about dealing with internal conflicts, handling complaints, and broadcasting regular announcements that say that there are codes of practice, and if somebody has a problem, they can find out about the codes of practice and they can make a complaint. So that's the first code. It's about linking the station to the community and making sure that everybody can come in and be part of it. Second code is about diversity and independence. So this is a real core at the heart of community broadcasting. Because community broadcasting is open to everybody, this principle is that the station will be open to people who may not have a voice elsewhere. If their point of view, if their voice can't be heard somewhere else, they can find a community station and they can get on air and they can have their voice heard. So it's about the station being open to everybody equally. Of course, you still have to do all the things. You have to know how to work the panel, you have to do your training, but the principle is that you can come on. And if you're in a disadvantaged group, then you probably get some priority, because this kind of station has the mission to give you a voice. Policies and procedures will have mechanisms to enable active participation in the running of the station. So that's AGMs, you can go to board meetings, you can talk to the board and the management about all the things that you want to talk to them about. There'll be policy documents about volunteering and rights and responsibilities of everybody involved in the station. 2RRR has those, and they're freely available. I think they're on the website, and certainly they're in the station. And this last one is about the station trying to break down prejudice. So that's one of the principles of community broadcasting, that wherever there is prejudice, the station would try and do something, get someone on air or put something in place that would help the people involved in the station overcome prejudice, and also, more importantly, use the medium of radio to help the community understand and overcome prejudices. So it's a pretty important principle. Number 3 is about programming, and there's a heap of that stuff. Just some key points. The first one is that we're not going to broadcast material that's going to incite or encourage violence or brutality. Seems pretty obvious, but sometimes you get people like talk radio shock jocks on 2GB encouraging listeners to go down to Bondi Beach with baseball bats and bash up people. Alan was slapped over the wrists for that some years ago in the Cronulla riots time. So these things are important to put there, even though it's pretty obvious that you wouldn't want to do that. It has to be put down in writing. Also, community stations will not mislead or alarm listeners by simulating news or events. So that code would prohibit War of the Worlds being broadcast these days. But, I think people have got a bit more sophisticated over the years. War of the Worlds panicked America in 1938, was it? On Halloween Eve, because radio was really new and people didn't understand, and they thought that everything that came out of that box was true. And that's why, really, that amazing radio play by Orson Welles, War of the Worlds, a dramatisation of H.G. Wells' book, that's why it was so powerful. It was a great dramatisation, but it was powerful because radio was new. Very interesting. We've become much more sophisticated about consuming radio now, and so I don't think that anybody would be fooled by a radio play these days in the way that they were. But I wonder if we're seeing the same phenomenon again. Is the magic box now these things? Think about all the things that people believe that come in their Facebook feed and Twitter. Maybe we need to get a bit more sophisticated about that in coming years too. The third thing is that community stations won't present as desirable the use of illegal drugs and alcohol. So you can talk about drugs and alcohol, but the point is you don't glamorise it. By all means, if there's a discussion to be had about the dangers of alcohol or smoking or some issue that's come up, don't shy away from it. You can talk about that, but the point is that you shouldn't make it glamorous. You shouldn't say anything that would encourage people to take up smoking or take up illegal drugs. And the other point is that we will not glamorise or sensationalise suicide. And you know, there was an old principle some time ago that media just didn't talk at all about suicide. But that kind of hushed it all up, and then it became a taboo subject and nobody could seek help. So in recent years, the thinking about how to talk about suicide has changed. Nowadays, if we talk about somebody who's committed suicide or somebody who's thinking something that might lead to suicidal tendencies, then now the principle is tell people how to get help. Tell people how to recognise the signs in their colleagues, their friends or family, and to seek help. So it's not that we don't talk about it anymore. We talk about it, but in context. The key point, though, is not to portray suicide as a kind of quick fix or escape. And you know, sometimes people who are distressed enough to contemplate suicide think of it as a way out, as a quick fix to the problems of their life. So that's the point that we don't put on air, because people might grasp on that and sadly they might take some action. So there's some of the key principles there. Some other points. The station and programs will try to avoid censorship and influence. So you know that in commercial radio that people on air are heavily influenced by their advertisers. They'll extol the virtues of companies that advertise on the station, and they'll probably not talk about the bad things about some companies that advertise on their station. And in commercial radio, that's okay, because that's the nature of commercial radio, it's understood. In community radio, community broadcasters don't like that principle. They don't accept that that's the right way to go. And so the onus on you is not to be influenced by a sponsor, an advertiser, or some pressure. Just say what you should say it in the correct way, and say what you think, rather than twisting your thoughts and your words to fit some kind of advertiser or sponsor. So that's the principle, that you won't be censored and you won't be affected by outside pressures, by politics, by commercialism or whatever. Now, of course, we all know in this world there are many things we have to think about before we talk, and so you just take into account all the normal considerations. But there's the principle of community radio is that the organisation itself does not censor you and restrict you in those ways. News and current affairs is a really important one. 2RRR doesn't have a big newsroom. It doesn't take a networked news feed. But generally, across the community sector, many stations do. And I think it's really important that they do. And I think there's a movement to strengthen news and current affairs in the community sector. And it's very timely. Those of you who've followed radio and media over the last few years have probably noticed that some big companies have bought up some little companies, and there's less news sources these days. For instance, in Sydney, there used to be two big talk radio news services, 2UE News and 2GB Macquarie News. Then Macquarie bought 2UE, and they closed the 2UE newsroom, they amalgamated the two, and now there's only one newsroom funneling news to those two stations. So there were quite diverse voices. 2UE News had different ways of looking and reporting things that 2GB did. Now they're all one. Just recently, Channel 9 has bought the Sydney Morning Herald and Macquarie Radio Network, including 2GB and 2UE. So now Channel 9 News plus the Herald plus 2GB and 2UE are all one newsroom. And you'll notice that their news editorial values will probably homogenise over time, and that reporters will decrease, reporting staff will decrease, and that there'll be much more sharing of content. Now that's just business, that's fine, it's commercial business, but 3 newsrooms have gone down to 1. So there's less diversity of voices in news and current affairs. And then think about all the news services that are coming in from outside our country. They bring us diversity, but they also bring us points of view from other countries. Something comes in from the BBC, a quality news service, but it's always going to be a British point of view. Is it the Australian point of view? Is it the local point of view? So the more that the pressures of commercial media force competition and contraction of newsrooms, I think the more important community broadcasting news is, because it's people like you at the grassroots who know what people are thinking and talking about, and who can report news from an Australian and from a Sydney and from a Ryde, Gladesville point of view, because you live here and you know the news. You're not taking a news service from the BBC in Britain or from Channel 9 through Sky or 2UE or 2GB. So I think community radio news and the strengthening of community radio news is going to be a really important thing for our country in the future, as many of the other professional newsrooms contract and merge. Code 4, Indigenous programming. There's a special code for Indigenous Australians because we recognise that they were the first people here. All the rest of us over generations have come here and we've settled Australia, but there were some first people here. And so the community sector has a lot of heart and support for the Indigenous people. And they, so much so that they put in a code which just reminds us to respect the Indigenous people. And also, a really key thing that I think this code tells us is, if we don't understand about an issue, then don't just jump to a conclusion, or don't just think that we know, or don't just get some other person, pull them in and ask what they think. Go to an Indigenous person and ask them what they think. Because how can any of us know, if we're not Indigenous, what it's like to be Indigenous and what the Indigenous point of view of a certain issue might be. So the principle that sits behind all of these things about using appropriate words and phrases and seeking proper advice, it's really a kind of principle that you would probably use for a lot of things. If you don't know, ask a person who does know. And when it comes to Indigenous issues, the people who know are the Aboriginal people. So find them and ask them if there's something that you want to talk about, rather than just jumping to a conclusion and saying what you think, which is fine, that's what you think, but it may not be well informed. So there's an extra level of respect that the community sector wants to give to the Indigenous people, and it behoves us to inform ourselves before we just start shooting off at the mouth and talking about things we don't really understand. Australian music. The community sector is a huge supporter of Australian artists. When you think about this, think about the richness that music gives to a culture. When you have great artists, great songwriters, great musicians, a culture is richer. It reflects our culture back to us, and it uplifts us, it enriches us. So we want to encourage Australian musicians. And the way that the community sector encourages them is to set a quota so that across the station in any month, community stations promise to play a certain percentage of Australian music. It's 25% of Australian music across the whole station, across a month. So there might be programs that don't play Australian music because that's not the type of show they are. But the board of directors looks at the grid of all the programs and they think, well, okay, we've got these programs, they're not really, their brief is something that wouldn't play Australian music. So now we've got to get some Australian programs. Let's put some Australian new music programs, or Aussie heavy metal late at night, or whatever. And the board of directors always has to consider, across the week and across the month, have we got enough shows that are going to help the station achieve this quota? Now for you, in every individual program, it would be good if you can try and play 25% of Australian music. But if you can't, that's okay, because somebody else will probably play more. But try and do that. Now, if you're an ethnic program and you're playing ethnic music of your language, maybe there's an Australian singer who sings in that language. Maybe they sing a traditional song. So find the Australian singer who sings that, and then you've got a song in whatever language it is, but it's an Australian musician, so that counts. So just do what you can within the brief of your show to help the station achieve its overall 25% quota across the whole station, all the programs across the month. There are some exceptions. Ethnic and classical music stations have a lower quota, and that's 10%, because it's known that full-time ethnic stations like 2000 FM, for instance, would hardly have the chance to play 25% Australian artists. And it's also known that most classical music is not Australian originated, although over the decades we're getting more and more classical composers, so who knows what might happen in the future. Just a little bit on music here. This goes to copyright as well. So let me talk about copyright and how that works too at this point. Every radio station pays a fee to a collecting society. Those collecting societies are APRA, AMCOS and the PPCA. APRA is Australian Performing Rights Association, AMCOS is Australian Mechanical Copyright Owners Society, I think, and PPCA is the Photographic Performance Company of Australia. Each of those societies collects money on behalf of the people who own the rights to the music. They collect for the writers of the song, they collect for the singers, the performers, and they collect for the record companies that publish those songs. And over the years, it's become a pretty well-oiled machine. All these collecting societies work on behalf of the artists or the record companies, and they collectively negotiate with radio stations. Very long ago, before copyright collecting societies, radio stations had to think about paying each artist to play their song. And that was a nightmare. Now, that went out long ago, in the 30s, before the Second World War. But theoretically, that's what you should do. You should pay for the rights to use every song that you play. The principle is that you're making money out of playing someone's music. So you can't steal that. If you make some money, you should give some of that money back to the person who wrote the music. After all, their music is making money for you. So the principle of copyright goes to the law of stealing. You don't steal someone's work without paying them for it. If you use it, you should pay them. Now, how much should you pay? What's a fair deal? Well, that's always hard. It was very hard in the past, before the copyright collecting societies. And because the radio stations, and in fact television stations and other media, needed to negotiate with groups rather than with individual artists, both sides came to good agreements. The copyright collecting societies negotiated with the radio station sectors, not each individual station, but the sector representatives, and they reached a deal. And that deal was that, depending on what section you're in, ABC, SBS, commercial or community, you will pay a percentage of your revenue towards copyright. And as long as you pay every year, you've got a right to use any commercially, properly published music. And then the copyright collecting societies will do all the work for you. They will distribute that money. You don't have to go and find Jimmy Barnes and write him a cheque for $25 because you played Working Class Man. They'll look after that. How does it work? Well, each station pays its annual fee through, in this case for community radio, through the CBAA. And the CBAA pays APRA, AMCOS and the PPCA. And then stations, not all stations do this, but a selection of stations submit their playlist during APRA Sample Week. And that playlist is aggregated with all the playlists of all the other stations that are sampled. And the copyright collecting societies make a list. And whoever's up the top of the list, if they got 10% of plays on Australian radio stations, then they'll be top. And then the next person might have got 9.97% and 9.96, all the way down to 0.001. So they make a list of the most played to the least played artists. And then they just take all the money in the pot and they go, okay, Jimmy Barnes, you got 10% of plays, so we made $1 million, take 10% of that $1 million. And they just go and divide it down in a known ratio, paying the artists a percentage of the pool of money that they got back from radio stations. So that's roughly how it works. There are some detailed technicalities behind it, but that's the principle, that radio stations pay, goes into a pool, and then the artists get a cut of that based on how much airplay they got. And it's a good thing to do. I sometimes hear people complain about paying the copyright and the annoyance of writing the songs and APRA. But it's a really good thing to do because it helps our artists, our musicians, enrich our culture. If they didn't get that money, what would they be doing? Waiting tables, driving taxis? They wouldn't be writing great songs. They'd be just doing something to make enough money. So the fact that radio stations pay money and they get some of it helps artists get rewarded for their work and be able to write more great songs. And the community sector is extremely supportive of Australian artists, which is why they voluntarily aim for that 25%, so they can get lots and lots of Australian artists on that list. My son is a singer. His band name is Bus Vipers, and he made some tens of thousands of dollars out of royalties over the last few years, and that helped him fund time to go and write his next album and get it produced up. So I know firsthand that there's a benefit directly to Australian musicians. And I also know many musicians who, these days it's an electronic bank transfer, but in the past there would be cheques. And I know musicians who got a cheque from APRA for something like 25 cents. I mean, they would never bank it, but they kept it because it said somewhere in Australia some radio station played my song. So it kind of uplifted them anyway. It's not just about money, it's about more than that. So copyright works that way, and I think it's a good thing. I think it's good because in the end it helps support our musicians and enriches our culture. So it's a bit tedious, and stations would rather not pay the money, I'm sure, they'd rather keep it, but in the scheme of things, it's for the good. So that's why this quota is here. Code 6, sponsorship. This is a big alarm bell. If you ever get a sponsor to come to the radio station and sponsor the station, then that's a good thing, should do that. Station always needs funds, but be clear to them the difference between sponsorship and advertising. You can advertise on commercial radio and you can say lots of things and you can puff up your product very well, and that's allowed on commercial radio. But commercial advertisements are not allowed on community radio. There's a slight difference between the word ad or commercial and the word sponsorship. The principle of sponsorship is that they are supporting the station. And so there's some technical differences. Whereas you can say pretty much anything within certain rules on commercial radio, you can't say just anything on community radio. You have to follow some guidelines. And those guidelines are that the station must not put to air in any hour more than 5 minutes of sponsorship. That's a big difference from 2Day FM. You hear a 5-minute ad break at 20 past the hour, another one at 22, another one at 5 to the hour. If they can fit 30 minutes of ads into a 60-minute hour, they'll happily do it. And there's nothing to stop them because they pay a lot of money for those licenses. That's their business. But community radio is different. You can't just pack in the ads. There is a 5-minute limit in any hour. And by the way, it's not flexible. You can't put 4 minutes into 1 hour and then bank 6 minutes into the next hour. It's every hour, 5 minutes, tight limit. The other compulsory element is that you must acknowledge the company as a sponsor. So there must be some words that say something like, this company sponsors 2RRR. This is a sponsor, proud sponsor. You can work it into the ad itself, the sponsorship announcement, sorry. You can work it into the text, or most commonly you can put it as a tag at the end. As long as you follow those two rules, you're pretty safe. But actually many people don't. and stations get into a lot of trouble, technical breaches of just going over the rules. Probably the most common breach is where you embellish the sponsor. So let's say Joe's Butchery down there at Hunters Hill is a sponsor of 2RRR, and they've got a 30-second sponsorship announcement which fulfills all the aims, all the requirements, and you play it, and you play another 4.5 minutes. So you've got 5 minutes of sponsorship in your hour. But you happen to know Joe, and you go to his butchery, and you really like his meat. And after Joe's sponsorship announcement, you say, "Oh, Joe, good morning, Joe. Nice to have you as a listener. Great to have you as a sponsor. Gee, I love the chops I got from you the other day. They were on special. I think it was only $13 a kilo. That was so good. Thanks, Joe." Uh-oh. You've just gone over the 5 minutes, and you've just embellished Joe's technically correct sponsorship and brought it into non-compliance because you've turned it into an ad. You've made it more than 5 minutes and you've embellished it in a way that's not really the way that a sponsorship should be done. So the best thing to do is when you play a sponsorship announcement, if you know the people, if you use them, that's fine. It's great that they're supporting, but the sponsorship is what they've paid for. You don't need to say too much more about it. Just play the thing, let the message go, and then move on.
Can I ask, is there a legal requirement, Steve, with CSAs and station promos?
Good question. So the question's about CSAs, community service announcements and promos. If they're genuine community benefit announcements, no, there are no restrictions.
So you could have the whole hour with that?
Yes, technically you could. I mean, it'd be a terrible hour, but yes, you could. Yes, yes.
There's no time limit.
Yeah. No, they don't fall into that. But the thing to be careful of is particularly music events that may make a profit. So anything that's a not-for-profit organisation, go your hardest. But anything that has a profit-making element to it, then it's kind of a grey area. Mm-hmm. And this is what I would suggest. Let's say the RSL club has a big singer there, and you're doing an announcement, you love that singer, you've got some tickets, you're going to go and see them, you wax lyrical about it. Because it's a community club, it's okay to do that, but where you might go over the line is it might become a commercial promotion if you talk about the tickets, if you talk about where to get the tickets. So best to say, my favourite singer is at the Ride RSL, they're on this Tuesday at 8 o'clock, go and look at the website for details. That way you're not turning it into a commercial promotion.
We've got a philosophy at 2RRR where we actually do at least play a CSA during the hour. And
I think that's really important.
Yeah, but also we've got station promos as well. Do we have to do that legally?
No.
No,
there's no compulsory requirement. Yeah. It's just a really good thing because it shows that you're representing the community.
Of course. Okay, thanks.
Great questions, thanks. Yep, Tony.
See, there's a fine line between, say, sponsorship and business.
Yep.
So can you read that in a way that we are getting to the, crossing the border?
So you want some more examples?
Yes.
One of the most common examples of breaches, beyond just going over the 5 minutes and not putting a tag, they're the most common things that get you in trouble. The next most common is fake competitions and talkback, where some sponsor will come on and offer a prize. and to get the prize you have to go down to their store, or maybe they'll offer a prize to the first 3 listeners who come on and bid or talk about some of their products. So that goes over the line, because that becomes hidden advertising. And definitely that's the regulator, ACMA, would deem that as advertising and would count it towards your 5 minutes, and would also put you in breach because you're advertising, not sponsoring. So it's a technical difference between what you can do on commercial radio and what you can do on community radio.
If you've got a sponsor that's actually stating their message about what they do, that is not commercial.
That's right, as long as they say, let's say my company sponsors, if I came on in my voice and said, "Hi, I'm Steve Ahern, my company, Ahern Media and Training, is running a course this week, and we charge $50 a head, and the course starts on Tuesday and runs for the next 10 weeks. AMT is a sponsor of 2RRR, that would be fine. But if then we had a talk and you interviewed me and I pretended that I was talking about radio, but really I was trying to sneak in more plugs for my course, that's when we get into trouble.
So if you're doing a gig guide or something, and then you mention a venue, and you might know that the person next door, maybe a record store, so it's right next to this record store, and there might be a friend of yours or something like that.
That's fine. Yeah, that's not a problem, because that's information. And yeah, you mentioned a friend, but it's not like the ABC. The ABC, that would be a problem, because they have rules about not mentioning commercial businesses, but that's not a breach in community radio. Now, of course, if you went on to say that after you've been to the gig, the record store is open till 10 o'clock, so drop in and buy some of the albums, and I know they're on special, then that's going too far. More questions? Okay, then let's quickly finish this and have a coffee break. The last significant code is complaints, and people are entitled to complain. After all, the citizens of Australia give you a licence for free. They give community radio licences for free to community groups. So for that benefit comes some responsibilities. And one of the responsibilities is to listen to what people think about your shows. So people have a right to complain, and it's good that they complain, because you know they're listening and you know they're engaged. So always welcome complaints and receive them in a way where you think about it, and then if you can improve your show based on that complaint, then go ahead and improve it. So it's important to be open to receiving complaints. But there's 2 different types of complaints. One is just a complaint from the annoyed person who rings up and didn't like the song you played, or didn't like your voice or something you said. That's just between you and your listener, and they're giving you feedback. And you can choose to do something with that or not. I would do something with it. If anyone rings you up, I'd give them the courtesy of saying, "Thanks, I just talked to Margaret on the phone. She gave me some really good thoughts about the show. Sorry you didn't like the song with the swearing. Here's a song I hope you might like, Margaret." You know, something like that. Acknowledge what Margaret, the complainant, has said, and then try and do something that will make them feel good. But there's another level of complaint. If something is considered serious by the person, not by you, doesn't matter whether you consider it serious or not, it's the person complaining. If the person complaining considers it serious, then they are entitled to make a formal complaint. And anyone who's ever worked in government would know that there's all these forms. Like if someone complains, you have to give them a form that says, yeah, you know what, you can complain even more. Here's the process for complaints. Well, it's the same kind of thing. There is a process, and we have to tell people that if they consider their complaint serious, they should make it formal, they should put it in writing, they should email it or send it to the station, and there will be a process for dealing with that. And every station has to have a process. There's some rules about that process. First rule is that when you get a complaint, you have to respond to the complainant within 60 days. Doesn't mean you have to solve the problem, it just means you have to acknowledge that you've received their complaint and you're going to do something about it. And then usually what happens is that complaint will go to the board will talk about it, they'll consider is it a serious complaint or not. If they consider it's not a serious complaint, they should write back to the person, tell them why they believe it's not serious, and that's it. They've done their job. Now, of course, the person, if they don't accept that, can take it further. But you don't have to just respond to a complaint just because someone's made it. You can consider what to do with it. If you consider the complaint is frivolous or whatever, write them back a polite letter. You've looked into it, tell them what you've done, but tell them that you resolved that the issue was to be taken no further. If the problem is big, then you should do some internal things. The board will talk to the presenter, will maybe ask the presenter to do an apology or put more information or do an interview with the person aggrieved. Might be a range of things they might do, and then they'll write to the person and say what they've decided to do to fix the problem. But you have to respond within the first response within 60 days, and the station has to seriously consider the complaint and then decide what to do. I must say that in my experience, most complaints from people can be diffused by just listening politely to them. If they're on the phone or if they've emailed you, read it seriously, even if it's kind of a bit confronting or insulting. Don't just get hot-headed and write back and tell them off. Listen, consider what they've said, and then if somehow you can reflect their point of view in your show, most complaints will go away. Because all they want to do is either help you to tell you something they think you didn't know, or to force you to put another point of view, which in the end is not such a bad thing to do. So if you listen politely, if you accept what people say and think about it and think about some way to incorporate it into the show, and then you tell them what you did, most people will be happy. And in the end, you want happy listeners who support you. So try and diffuse a problem at that level before it becomes an official complaint. But always remember that they do have the right to complain if they want to. The last one is about reviewing the codes regularly. So all of those codes you can find on the CBAA website, cbaa.org.au, in the news and publications section, or just search within the website Codes of Practice. If you want to find out any more information about those codes, 2 minutes will get you right there, and you'll click on it and you'll be able to read the whole details of the code. What I've told you now are just the highlights, so that you'll know when there could be a problem, and then you can go and seek more information and check it out. Questions, comments?
Are there any restrictions if you get your own sponsors for your own shows?
No.
None at all.
Not from the code's point of view. The station might have some policies about that, but no, nothing. Yep.
Regarding the Australian music, must it be people who are like citizens of Australia, or can it be music that is made in Australia by producers in Australia, but the artist may be from a different country?
If the record company publishing the song was Australian, then it would count as Australian. But if it was just a foreigner recording, you know, they've just come to Australia for a holiday, booked some hours of time in a studio and recorded, possibly not. But if they used Australian session musicians, then it would be Australian. So it would depend. In most cases, I think yes is probably the answer. There would probably be enough Australianness in there, in the production side or the supporting musician side, to be counted. Now, it doesn't count as 100% Australian, and the way that those artists are credited would be known to the Copyright Collecting Society. So let's say if there's a famous Malaysian singer, comes here, loves Australia, books a studio for a week and hires 10 Australian session musicians, then that singer who might have written all his songs is not counted as Australian, but the recording is probably counted as recorded and published in Australia, and the session musicians would be Australian musicians for the purpose of getting a royalty.
I'm just thinking more like, you know, independent artists who like probably study here and they write music here.
Yeah, right. Yes, well, it does depend. So if you're not a citizen and you're not publishing in Australia or using Australian musicians, probably is not Australian music in a technical sense. I've got a few hands. This one was next.
So if you're doing a podcast of a show and you've got sponsorships within that program,
Yep.
what's the legality as far as that goes?
That's fine. In fact, there's very few restrictions on podcasting from the point of view of copyright and codes of practice, because technically a podcast is not a broadcast. So none of these things technically apply. Of course, they're all good principles and you probably want to do them anyway, but you've got much more leeway in a podcast. Now, if the podcast is exactly the same as the program you put on air, then you must comply. But if it's only made for podcast, then you don't have to follow any of these rules.
Your own, which it's already got there, it proves a podcast.
Yes, well, if it's gone to air, then you have to comply with all the rules. And so putting the sponsorships in the podcast is fine. What's not fine, mostly, actually, community sector is different. So it's generally fine to rebroadcast the program as a catch-up podcast. There are some restrictions in the other sectors about music, and many commercial stations actually cut out the music because they don't have rights to podcast the music. They have rights to broadcast, but not podcast. But sponsorships, no problem. There are some other hands? Yep.
Steve, just about opening and closing themes. If you use the same theme every week, is that illegal? Or?
No. Is it someone's piece of work, like a song?
Yes.
It's counted as a song. Now, if you do some production and you put other things over it, then it probably falls into another category, more like a promo, where you should be crediting the person and paying the person. But if it's just you open the show with that song and then you fade it down and talk over it, then it's just a song.
Same way with the weeks and all that?
Fine. Yep, no problem.
Thank you.
If we play some music from overseas, how can we deal with those copyright issues? And if we use the music from YouTube, so what we should do?
I've got to tell you the official answer. The official answer is that the station pays its copyright fee. So as long as you have broadcast published music, properly published music, then the station's done all the right thing, you're covered. But where you personally get that music might be a problem for you. It's not really a problem for the station, because the station pays, but are you breaking the law by getting that from somewhere illegal? And if the answer is yes, then you shouldn't do it. That's the official answer. The reality is that many people do it, and as long as they credit the singers, then that singer will still get a royalty. But the point is, how are you obtaining it? Are you obtaining it illegally? So if you find a song on YouTube in, what language are we talking? Chinese?
Or any
Yeah,
language.
yeah. So if you find a song in a language and you want to play that song, rather than just rip it out of YouTube, try and find the source of the song and obtain it legally so that you've got all the proper credits and everything is done properly. It's really hard for ethnic music because sometimes you can't source it, but that's the principle. You should try and obtain it legally because it's your responsibility for songs that you get. The station's done what it has to do, but there's another responsibility. Yep.
Oh, just following on from that one, really. Is there a way to, hypothetically, is there a way that can be audited?
In broadcast sense, the audit is a sample. So you would have to list the song, the artist, and they will check it. But it's pretty hard to prove it, that you've used an illegal source. It's actually much easier to prove it online now, and there's all sorts of protections and electronic ways of knowing which song it was and who had the rights. And so if you put things up on your YouTube channel or on Facebook, you might get a takedown notice from a big high-profile artist if you've used their song. So these days in the electronic world, it's really easy to audit it. In broadcast, it's not that easy. But again, it's still a responsibility that you shouldn't take seriously. Yep.
A couple of questions. One is Spotify. I mean, would Spotify be a legal way of doing it rather than YouTube?
Actually, it's not, because when you read the terms and conditions of Spotify, it says that this is for personal use and your subscription is for that. The reality, of course, is that many people do use those sources, but technically, no.
The other one was ownership of podcasts. I mean, if you podcast and you have music on a podcast, do you own your podcast with the music, or is there still the copyright
No,
issue?
the person who wrote and published the music owns the copyright, and you are licensing the use of that music for them. So as long as you do everything you should do, you're allowed to use it, but the ownership always is retained by the artist
So that
or
would
by
be,
the publisher.
Say if you're podcasting, putting on Mixcloud, that's legal because Mixcloud's got all that site sorted out.
Yeah, actually Mixcloud is probably one of the best ones. Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you do actually interview somebody, there's no music at all, then you do own it. If it's
Yes,
podcast.
yes. But do you own it or does the station own it? So if it was first broadcast on the station, you own the moral rights, but the station owns the
If it
technical
was made
copyright.
at the station but not broadcast
Sure.
on the station, you do
Yeah,
own it.
then you own it.
That's what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
It's funny, those little technicalities.
Yeah, absolutely.
And most of them, in reality, would not get you into trouble, but it could be the one exception where somebody objected to something and they found a technical breach.
Barrel because they don't
Exactly.
particularly like the interview or something.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Good. Yep.
Lyrics of songs, particularly say from the 1940s,
Yep.
that if not promoting smoking, mentioning it, for example, maybe it's cold outside,
Yeah.
or just a cigarette more,
Yeah.
that's okay and without comment.
Yeah, I think so. It's funny these days. Community standards are changing, and there are a few things that people start to object to. But technically, ACMA and whatever department regulates tobacco has never objected to that yet. So probably it's okay. But who knows what might happen in 10 years' time, you know?
And possibly better not to draw attention to it by saying, oh, we wouldn't do that now, or would you think that would be a good thing?
Either. So I couldn't see a problem either way. So to ignore it is good because you're not drawing attention. But if you said, you know, that's a historical anomaly, and gosh, isn't it amazing how times have changed? So few people smoke now, and yet 50 years ago, most people did smoke. Isn't it good that we don't smoke like that anymore? That should be fine. Yep.
How do you find out if music's in public domain or not?
As in copyright free? These days it's pretty easy. You just Google copyright free music or copyright free production music, and there are many sites that provide that. And the reason why they do that, especially for production music, is that they want you to maybe buy some more or use the artist more or whatever. So there's generally some kind of quid pro quo. Might be just to promote a young artist, or it might be for something more. But it's really easy these days. In the past it was really hard to find that, but you can just find it on the web now.
Thank you.
Just a quick addition to what Ryan was saying for a question. If we've had a guest on Breaking Bands and they endorse drugs or alcohol, is there a quick way we can say, here at Triple R we don't endorse this behaviour? And sort of distance ourselves with that guest,
Yes.
in a good way?
And that's a really good thing to think about, because many musicians could do that, and good on you for thinking about it. So, of course, you could pre-record them and then you could cut it out, but if they're live, then that's the way to do it. So you say, look, I've heard what you said there, but I've just got to let you know that all of us on this show and this station, we don't endorse using drugs and alcohol, and we wouldn't like our listeners to follow your lead. And that, even though you've published a promotion of alcohol, you've then mitigated against it. So unless someone was really trying to find trouble, they would think that was okay. Good. Let's take a coffee break of just 10 minutes. Okay, so now we come on to the area which could cost you $250,000 if you get it wrong. So let's focus. This is defamation. So defamation, you might also hear the words slander and libel. So defamation is a word that covers all of that, and it relates to broadcast. What I'm going to tell you is what defamation is, and then what you can do about it. This first slide defines defamation. So if you look in a law book, it will have a long paragraph saying something like, defamation occurs when information is broadcast that decreases a person's reputation in the eyes of right-thinking citizens. And then it will go on for more words. But I like to simplify it. There's really three elements to understand what is defamation. And I'd like you to think about it like baseball. 3 strikes and you're out. 2 strikes and you're safe. 1 strike, you're safe. So there are 3 key things about defamation. 3 shuns: publication, identification, reputation. So to understand what defamation is, just think about these 3 shuns. If you have all of them, you're in trouble. If you don't have all of them, you're safe. So let's spend a little bit of time understanding what each one is. Publication first. So in regards to radio, when we're on the radio, if we're live to air, if we push that mic and the audience is listening to us, we are publishing because we are making things public. So anytime you talk on the radio, you are publishing. Some people get confused by that. They think of newspapers, publications. That was true 100 years ago, but then radio was invented and television and the internet. So the lawyers and societies, lawmakers, changed the definition to include all types of electronic media that make information public. So, by going on the radio and turning on the mic and talking live, you are automatically publishing. So, you've got strike one. Because you're making the information public. Now, what can you do to protect yourself against that? Well, you can pre-record. If you think that something's going to cause problems, instead of inviting the person in live to air, then go to their place, bring your Zoom microphone, thanks for that, Andrew, and record them. And then, if they say something that shouldn't be made public, chop it out. So that's one way of protecting yourself, by not making it public immediately. The other way of protecting yourself is using a delay system. And all of the big talkback radio stations use delay. Problem for you at 2RRR is you don't have a delay system, so you can't use that. But let me explain it anyway, because it's a very common thing. Talk radio stations like ABC Sydney, 2GB, 2UE, where they just invite people to ring up and say anything they like, they always have to use a delay system. Because if you think about it, if you ring up a radio station, they don't know who you are, they don't know what you're going to say, they just put you on air. So they have to have some way of taking you off air if you're going to say something bad. So delay works by recording the signal from the studio and releasing it to broadcast a few seconds later. Now that used to be 7 seconds, and you'll hear people talk about 7-second delay system. That was the old days, and that was because a technical reason, they used to use a loop tape on a cart, and if you had more tape than 7 seconds, the tape would break. So it was just a technical thing. There's no special reason why it has to be 7 seconds. These days, it's an electronic box, and you can just adjust the time to whatever you like.
Right.
Most people still keep it at 7 seconds because they like the challenge. If you're a professional talk broadcaster, it's, you want that 7-second challenge. When I'm on air broadcasting, if I'm using it, I can usually spot the deformation. It takes me about 2 seconds. 1 second to change my monitoring, 1 second to press the delay button, and I've got a whole 3 seconds to think about what I'm going to do next, so it's no big deal. But if you're not used to it, 7 seconds is an awfully short time, and I would suggest turn it up to 30 seconds because you might need it. Anyway, that's what delay is. It holds the signal, so everything is said in real time in the studio. It goes into a box, it's just a recorder, and the recorder lets it out sometime later. And at any time, if you push the dump button, it will erase what's in that recorder. And so what was said in the studio by a caller to you is heard by you, it's heard by the caller, it's heard by the people in the control booth, but it's not made public because it's not heard by the public. So that's how you protect yourself. It's not hard really once you understand the principle. It's just, is it going public? If so, strike one. If not, I'm using some system to delay it being public, and then I can protect myself. Second shin is identification. So this is also reasonably straightforward. So identifying someone by naming them is the most common way to identify. So once I say your name on the radio, then I've got a second strike. I'm publishing, I'm live, and I've named you. So I've identified you. So once you're at those 2 points, then you get into dangerous territory. But so what you could do is not name the person. If you don't name a person, if you talk about a case or something that happened, but you don't identify the person involved, you're safe. Because you only might have 2 strikes. So that's another simple way of discussing something that needs to be discussed without getting into the realms of defamation. But there are some complexities, because naming someone is not the only way you can identify them. There's another way. You can give enough information for people to work out who it is. And so you must be careful that you don't start to describe the person in enough detail so that people can work it out. If I say the lady in the back row with the green jacket, then everyone can work out I'm talking about Grace, smiling there at us. So I've given you enough information in the context of being able to easily look around the room to work out who it was. So if you're going to talk about something and you're going to talk about a case that happened, then make sure you're careful not to give enough information for people to recognise the person. So it's only people who would know them, that's the test. Have you given enough information so that if somebody who knows that person was listening, they would work out that it's the person? If you have, strike 2. You're in danger. There's a third way also. Mistaken identification. Because many people have similar names. That's why when you listen to especially news bulletins about arrests or court case, they'll over-identify a person. So you might hear John Frederick Smith, a 34-year-old unemployed labourer of Blacktown, did something. The reason why they put all those details in is to make sure that you know that it's John Frederick Smith, not John James Smith, who also lives in Blacktown. Or if you just said John Smith, there might be 50 John Smiths who live in Blacktown. So mistaken ID is very possible if you just name a person, because there might be somebody else with that same name who hasn't done the thing. Now the guilty person who you're talking about, if you've identified them and a court finds them guilty, that's fine. You can name them. You can identify them. We do that in news bulletins all day, every day. That's news. But if someone else by that same name is identified mistakenly, they could sue you because you've led all their friends to think that they just robbed a bank or did something. So that's why if you're uncertain, over-identify the person to save mistaken identification. So that's the second element. Identification, publication. Once you know that, it's not that hard. 3 elements to that. If you're careful about them, you can avoid it. Publication is going public, and there's 2 things you can do to mitigate against that. The third one is not so simple. The third shin, reputation. Because what ruins a person's reputation? Let's just think about it for a bit. There are some few things that in our society would clearly ruin a person's reputation. Calling someone a pedophile is a terrible thing, and accusing somebody of that would certainly bring down their reputation. But what if I cheated the tax department out of $20 by fiddling my tax return? Would you think less of me, or would you just go, good on you, bloody tax department, they take too much tax anyway? Probably most people would think that. So fiddling your tax return to get a $20 gain is probably not something that would be serious enough for most people to think it had ruined my reputation. And the test is, would they shun you, avoid you, not do business with you because they no longer like you now that they've heard this information? But the tax example, what if I was the treasurer? In fact, it happened to Paul Keating years ago. If you're the treasurer of Australia, a politician, a member of government who deals with money and tax and runs the tax department, then your reputation depends on this area of properly managing money. So if you cheated on your tax even for $20, but you were the treasurer of Australia, that could be something that would ruin your reputation, because people would say, look, it's only $20, but he's the treasurer, he should manage money properly, and we expect him to do that, and therefore we don't trust him anymore. So that could have ruined that person's reputation. Yep.
Say in the case of me, say treasurer, if that happened like say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, even before when they were not treasurer or not in politics, even that can be...
Yes, I think if the person was came to the position of being treasurer of Australia and that was brought up, even though it had happened years ago, yes, you would think so. And in fact, that's why in politics they have the dirt files on everybody, so that they can bring up bad things and try and ruin their reputation and get them not elected.
What if it's true?
If it's true and you can prove it's true, then you can say it. And that's, I've just answered your question immediately, but that's the second part, that's the flip side of the coin. And we'll come to that in a minute in more detail. Other questions? So another couple of examples. If I'm going down a steep hill and it's a 50k zone and I'm doing 55 k's, and at the bottom of that hill is a tree with a policeman hiding with a speed camera waiting to get me for that 5 extra kilometres and get his $250 fine. Do you think you would think less of me if you found out that I'd been going 55 down a hill in a 50 zone and the policeman was hiding waiting to catch me? Probably not. Probably say, bloody cops, you know, they're always there, geez. But what if it was at 3:15 and in that hill was a kindergarten and there were children crossing? Then you would think me very irresponsible for not taking notice of children about and going down the hill, even though it's down the hill, the car can get a bit faster. But I should be watching out for those little kids and I should have my foot on the brake. You probably would think me very irresponsible then, and it might ruin my reputation. So it kind of depends. And that's why you can't just have a list of clear things that ruin a person's reputation. It depends on the circumstances, and it depends on how people would interpret that act or that information. So that's the hard part. And I can't give you a list. My best thing to say to you when you're trying to work out what could ruin a person's reputation, put your own name in there. So whatever you're going to say, put your own name there. If it doesn't feel right, don't say it that way. That's probably the simplest way to describe it. Because if that would make you feel bad about yourself, and you think that if other people found out, they wouldn't like you, then that's what I'm talking about. That would ruin your reputation. Doesn't mean you can't say it, it just means you have to think carefully about how you say it. So, 3 strikes and you're out. You've committed defamation. 2 strikes and you're safe. 1 strike and you're safe. So think carefully if you think there's anything you're going to talk about that involves people and it involves talking about something that might bring their reputation down. Now, the reason why I started carefully explaining what is defamation is because once you commit a defamation, it's a defamation. You've defamed someone. There's no ifs or buts, it's just you've defamed them. But what happens next is the significant thing. Because in media, we defame people all the time. We tell people about bad things that happened and we get away with it. Why? Because we can defend it. There's a reason to broadcast it, generally because it's important for the public to know. But more to the point, we can prove it. So, the defences of defamation are these 3. If you can prove one of these in a court of law, then it's okay. Yes, you defamed the person, but there was a reason for defaming. So let me explain each one. The defence of truth is pretty much straightforward, simple, as it's there. If you can prove it's true, then even though you defamed them, they can't sue you. And if they do sue you, they will lose. Sorry, I shouldn't have said they can't sue you. They could try and sue you, but they wouldn't because they would know that you could prove it's true. But this is not as simple as getting up on the witness stand and saying, "Oh, Your Honour, everyone knows he did it. Of course it's true." No. You have got to prove under the laws of evidence that it's true. You've got to present evidence that's admissible in court. There's got to be a photo. There's got to be fingerprints on the bag with the bribe money in it. There's got to be a sworn statement, an eyewitness, something that can prove under the laws of evidence in a court that it's true. Just saying, "Oh, it was on the front page of the Herald, Your Honour." Do not collect $200, do not pass go, straight to jail. Because how do you know if it's true? You can't prove it. Just because the Herald said it's true, where's your proof? So, you must test it. You must gather evidence. You must prove that it's true in a way that will be acceptable to a court. Because after all, people have a right to have their reputation protected, and this law does that. It's a balance between the public's right to know something, which may or may not be true, and a person's right to protect their reputation. So you have to do your homework to use this defence. If you just didn't think, you picked up a piece of paper, a newspaper, something off the internet, and you just shot your mouth off without any proof, then how can you prove it's true? You read it from a website. How do you know it's true? Have they got the evidence? Have they got the photographs and the fingerprints on the brown bag? If they have, good luck to them, but you don't have it, so you can't prove it's true. So you must be able to prove it's true in a court of law under the laws of evidence. Yep.
See, a lot of the time, say, these news publications like, say, Reuters or AFP, so these are the source of news.
Yep.
A lot of the time on their system is that, unless it is reliable and true and all that, you don't publish it.
Yep.
Okay,
So the question is about news services like Reuters, Agence France Presse and others. All of those, people pay a lot of money to subscribe to those to get the rights to use them, and those services use professional journalists and lawyers who check the details. And generally, if you were a subscriber to that service and you quoted them, then you could assume that what they had published and you had paid for the right to use would be true, and that they would have gone through the process of checking. And because you're a subscriber, you can rely on them in your court case if you come to court.
A lot of the time, newspapers, say Guardian or say newspaper, all these newspapers, they use those sources to put the to public and publishing. So when if it is say from a newspaper like Australian or say any newspaper, say you can't rely what if they say something about something.
No, you can't. I wouldn't like to trust the Australian or the Telegraph or the Herald. If it was my $250,000, I'd want to know. I'd want to at least call a journalist, ask them some questions, and then, if there was a matter of evidence, I'd say, look, do you know what? Can you just take a photo and email it to me so I can see it too? So I would do my due diligence and I would want to check. I wouldn't just trust someone who I didn't know to help me out if I got into court. Yep. Yep.
So if you repeat someone else's defamation, are you defaming them?
Absolutely. Yep. And the person suing can just trace down the line and sue all of you. Generally, the station is the first entity that is sued. So if you defame someone, then you're about to get the 2RRR radio station into a whole heap of trouble, potentially paying $250,000 if they lose the case. And you may or may not be individually joined into that action.
What if you say like the Herald is reporting today that?
Then it's still the same. Then if you repeat a defamatory imputation, then you are choosing to publish it. So even though you said the Herald's reporting it, you're the one who's telling the public some information that identifies a person and brings down their reputation.
And not be sure that press agencies you get a pass out. Press agencies that you subscribe to.
Yes. Yeah. If you've done that and they're a responsible agency, you can reasonably rely on the fact that they will have done that work. Yep.
This is involved on Facebook as well, so the Facebook application.
Well, you know, social media is a whole new ball game, and it's a nightmare, and people are defaming people all over the internet with no substance to the accusations, and I think that there should be more people suing each other for what's on Facebook, because much of it's not true, and someone needs to put a stop to it. If you were following the Rebel Wilson defamation action last year, I think good on her, because it's not social media, but it's similar. It's those trashy gossip magazines, New Idea and all that stuff, the Bauer group of magazines. For those who don't know, they published stories saying that she basically misrepresented herself. She lied about her background, and then because she was a liar, she was branded a liar, then people wouldn't hire her for any more film roles. And even though she plays a comedy character and is a pretty good actress, she's Australian, she completed a law degree at University of New South Wales, and she's a pretty smart person. And she decided that this has been going on too long, and that every star has rubbish just made up about them in these gossip magazines, and she was going to take a stand. And she also then took that further to all of their social media accounts, which is why I've kind of linked it to the answer there. And she won the case, and I think has set a benchmark where those gossip magazines can't just make things up with impunity. Now, in the end, they appealed, they got the damages reduced, but those publications were still guilty of defamation, and they still had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to her. And I think that's a great thing, because some media have just gone overboard and social media have gone further. And even though this is painful and tedious, it's actually not a bad thing to have in a society some laws that will protect your own reputation and your rights, especially against powerful media who could say anything and have more money and more power than you. So these are laws that give ordinary people some power to redress the balance against media that might use it against them. And I think that social media is out of control, and we're seeing limits pushed back on social media. Laws have come in Europe to push back social media, and Australia is seriously considering some laws. Social media is new. We don't know how to handle it yet. We're all just working it out. We're living in an era of change. In 100 years' time, they will have worked it out. There'll be laws that cover social media. The rules will be clear, just like they are with broadcasting. But at the moment, it's so new that we haven't caught up. The laws haven't caught up yet. So it's an interesting time to be in media and looking at this stuff. Yep.
I wanted to ask, what if like the radio announcer brings up a topic and asks the public what they thought about it, like, well, so I've heard that this thing has been happening. I wanted to check with the public what do you guys think about it, and tweet us, or
Yep.
What if that's the situation? Would that be?
If it's a theoretical topic and you're talking in general, you're fine, because you've not identified anyone. But once you identify someone, or a caller rings up and says, yes, pedophiles are terrible. The guy just down the road from me in Victoria Road at 147, I'm sure he's a pedophile. Bong. Then you've got three.
But if it's somebody else who says it, you're still in trouble.
Because you are the publisher. You've let it go to air.
What if you shut it down straight away?
If you shut it down, if it's been broadcast and they've broadcast the identification, it's been broadcast, you've made it public. But if you shut it down by dumping it, or if it had been pre-recorded, that's fine, it'll never get to air. But in this case, unlike the example before of the smoking and alcohol, and that's not a serious reputational issue, that's a codes and practices issue. Once you publish the person's name, you publish the defamatory accusation, and you're live to air, then all three, defamation.
Don't you sort of like play it down by laughing it off and saying, I'm sure that's not the case?
No,
and
because you just published it.
Right, okay.
And probably by talking about it, you made it worse. So you've got to really think, if you're going into those areas, think beforehand about how you're going to do it. Talk about the principle without talking about and identifying a person. Let's keep going. So, if you can prove truth, then you will win the case. and probably the person will know it, so they won't even begin the action. The second defence is the defence of opinion and fair comment. It's usually these days just called the defence of opinion. It's another one of those things where in our society we have to balance up conflicting things. In this case, the conflict is protecting an individual person's reputation with the right to discuss big issues, even if they defame someone. So in our society, which we're very lucky to live in, we live in a free society where we can discuss issues, then if you follow some rules, you can defame someone and you can still get away with it because you were discussing a principle and you had an opinion on this. But you have to do it properly. You have to state all the known true facts. You have to tell the listeners that it's your opinion, and you have to tell them how you arrived at that opinion. If you do all that, then you can use the defence of opinion. If you state all the known true facts, if you tell people it's your opinion, and you explain to them how you came to form that opinion, then you can use that defence. The reason why Alan Jones lost the Wheeler case recently, and by the way, he wins many cases. I don't particularly agree with his comments, but as a professional broadcaster, I admire his skills because he defames lots of people, but he comes right to the point where he can use one of these defences. And so technically he's a very good broadcaster because he pushes the boundaries but doesn't go over the boundaries. And he always uses this defence of opinion. But the problem with the Wheeler case, you remember the Wheeler case, it was the Wheeler family in Queensland. He said that the mines and dams that they built were responsible for a flood that then killed some people. And that's pretty damning. And he went full on his program for many weeks, blaming the Wheelers for the deaths of these people. And he kept up that defence all the way through to court because the Wheelers sued him for defamation. They believed they were not responsible for the deaths, and they rightly believed that everything he said was ruining their reputation and the reputation of their company. And so there was a lot of legal argument. They were in court for some time, and at one stage the Wheelers' defence or barrister asked Alan Jones, were you aware there was a professional report, government report, with scientists who looked into this? He said yes. Were you aware that that report found that there was no way that the work that they did in their quarry could have caused that flood? And he said, no, I didn't read the report. At that moment he lost the case because he did not communicate to his audience all the known true facts. That was a professional government report by experts. They were facts, there was information there, and he did not read it, so he was not aware of the facts and he didn't tell his listeners. That's why he lost the case. Not because he had an opinion. If he could have defended that position, he might have won the case. But he lost it because he didn't follow the rules. The third defence is protected reports. And this is about covering courts and parliament. And this is another one of those things which is about a balance of things in our society. So in court, when people go to court, you know that they say bad things about each other. That's what a court does. It has a case, some people come and they say that something was wrong, and other people come and say bad things about them. That's the nature of courts. They have to hear the bad things so they can make a judgment about what happened. So if the courts were subject to defamation, they'd never get anywhere. Because in the court, someone would get up in the witness box, say something bad about someone, and they'd stand up and say, I'm going to sue you for defamation. So the courts make themselves immune from defamation. So whatever is said in court is protected. You can't sue for defamation. And the beauty of that in our open society is that anyone could go to any court in our country, open the door, go and sit in the public gallery and watch. Because we have open courts, it's about justice being seen to be done. But in reality, if everyone in Sydney went to Central Local Court, it'd be packed. There's only a few benches there. So the media has a special privilege. The courts and the Parliament extend to the media that same protection. And so when we cover the courts, as long as we follow the rules, we don't report things that were said when the jury was out, we don't report people whose identities are protected, like young children and protected witnesses. As long as we follow all the rules and we put both sides of the case in our reports, then we can have the same protection. So we can defame someone by reporting what was said about them, and we're protected because the courts have extended that to the media, because the media are the eyes and ears of our society. We're pretty lucky to live in a place like this. And the same with the Parliament, because the Parliament also protects itself from that, because in Parliament we also have to hear some bad things sometimes. So as long as a reporter says this happened in Parliament and quotes what was said correctly, then they'll be protected. Yep?
What if you say allegedly?
Yes, if you say allegedly when relating to courts, that's fine, because it's an allegation in a court. But if you just pull out a magic word allegedly and chuck it into your conversation, it's not protecting you. Because if you publish something that identifies someone and ruins their reputation, you've published it. Whether you say allegedly or not, doesn't matter.
What if I prefix it with, this is not the truth? And then say, this is not the truth, Steve Ahern is a bad teacher.
Yeah, so, could be true. So the test is, if I turned on the radio after you'd said the words, this is not the truth, would it be defamation? Yes, because you're still publishing it, identifying the person and ruining their reputation. The only way you can get away with that is if it's comedy. And so if you've got some funny, crazy musical theme, and at the end of it you've got a punchline with music going da-da-da-da-da-da, something like that, then it's clearly comedy and not meant to be taken seriously. So sometimes satirists do use that this is not the truth kind of thing, and they say this is a comedy show, blah, 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 and they set it up, they bill it as a comedy show. Then you're safe, because comedy by its nature is not meant to be taken seriously.
What if you think it's funny and other people don't?
Yes, well you do have to make the judge laugh, but if it's just a joke within a program, then it's risky. But if your program is billed as a comedy show and it sounds like it's a comedy show, then you're okay, because you're clearly indicating that it's not a show to be taken seriously. But make sure the jokes are good and the judge can laugh.
So how do they take Carl Sanderman seriously?
How do they
How do they take Carl Sanderman seriously then?
Yeah, well, actually, he's never been sued for defamation. He's got in trouble for lots of other things, but he never has been sued for defamation because people just think he's a joke. Good questions. So our time is up. On the pages I gave you is pretty much what I've told you because it's my book and I wrote down what I say in lectures. So you can just read that over. Towards the end, there's some common misconceptions like allegedly and like it was in the newspaper, neither of which are saviours for you. And just refresh yourself on the 3 shuns and the 3 defences, and then you'll have enough information to sound the alarm bells. And that's what it's all about. You know, you go to law school for years to learn this stuff. This is only a couple of hours course. But hopefully you have enough information so that if there's something that could go wrong, you get a little warning bell in your head, and then you stop and you ask someone for advice. Okay.
Steve, quick question.
Yep.
So I can say all politicians are liars, but I can't say my local MPs are liars.
Correct. Exactly right. And the reason is because all politicians, there's a lot of them, so you're not identifying any one individual. But as soon as you say my local member is, then that's one individual identified. Good question. Okay, those who can help put away the tables and chairs, please do so. And I won't see you next week because I'll be in Cambodia, and Andrew will be teaching you next week. See you later.